are recording on Sunday, May 18th, 2025 at 2:04 p.m. Eastern Time with the one and only Mr. Leo Zagami, who's been on here several times before. And whereas I have a light blue shirt, Leo, if you're not listening, you should be watching. Leo's got an awesome powder blue suit on, and as always, he looks like a gangster in the best possible way. But to talk about your book, Confessions of Illuminati, Volume 12, you've been on here for most of them thus far. Um, but I believe you said this is the kind of closing, the closing work of this saga, and I'll let you kind of take it away. You guys can go to the description. You can find the link on Amazon. You can find the link to his website. I do have some questions about kind of the intelligence apparati within the Vatican, but before I do that, Leah, how are you doing, brother?
Doing great. Thank you for having me on. I'm glad that you went through the book and we will be able to really go into details of the book because at times, people invite me on the shows and they just scratch the surface because maybe they had only the possibility of reading one or two chapters. But I mean, this book, as you know, is the final installment, and there is a reason why. I, of course, had built up my series and the expectation for an ultimate installment that brings you right there on top of the pyramid where you're the all-seeing eye and where, of course, we find the controllers of the controllers of the controllers of the control. So a lot of people always ask me, who controls the Illuminati? Who controls the Freemasons? Who controls the think tanks? And so for the first time, I really wanted to go there in the disembodied eye, which was substituted for the pyramid's missing capstone, and gave you an understanding of the Jesuit general, of the Jesuits, their importance, their relevance in today's geopolitical as well as a religious scene. Because if you think this is a book about a group of priest in the Vatican with no relation to your daily life, well, you are very wrong, as you have noticed yourself. So I think that people will have a lot to learn from it. I got some great reactions. The book became a bestseller in various categories, including religious essays, historical essays, faith and spirituality, and of course, we have also published a book in a moment of great importance for the Catholic Church. Now we have had the official installation of the Pope, so the inauguration, but in reality, this Pope comes in after a Jesuit who has already turned around the church in favor of those progressive policies with the Jesuit order favorite since the Second Vatican Council, which was that pivotal moment, church history, where the progressive Masonic forces and the Jesuits cleared up, paved the way for the one world religion. And so I think that in this book, there is, of course, historical elements which are of importance because, I wanted to describe the birth of the Jesuits, but also how the Jesuits controlled the Illuminati and Freemasonry beyond any speculation. This, as you know, is a book that bases it's based on facts. It's based on academic sources, on testimonies of importance, verified, and of course, my own personal experience. But I most of all tend to want to fight the system by having a book that is clearly not debunkable. And so I had to really stick to the facts and everything that I could confirm from various sources. So it makes it really credible, this attack on the Jesuit order, because in the last 40 years, as you know, as I also wrote in the introduction, in what is the written in the blurb in the back of the book, nobody really had the courage to fight an order which controls the educational system and, of course, the academic world. So if you are a professor, if you are a researcher, and you go against the Jesuits, of course, your future is marked and you will no longer have that possibility. Now, I'm neither a professor, neither a researcher who is wanting some grants from the state of California, which is completely controlled by the Jesuits, by the way. And so I'm pretty free to give this a clear and honest take about the Jesuits. And so then I also explain how the Jesuits control today's world, how they control the educational system, the Machiavellian nature of the Jesuits since the Age of Enlightenment, how they have played this duplicity within the church, and also their role in the present politics and the present issues that unfortunately we have to face with the Democratic Party, which is like the political arm of the Jesuits here in the United States. Then we have, of course, how the Jesuits have destroyed the masculinity aspect more and more, and also how they have always been covering up for pedophilia and sexual abuse in the church. Then, of course, I explained how the former Pope Bergoglio, who was the last Pope, and why he is the last Pope, has rewrote papal history. He has rigged this conclave that gave us Pope Leo XIV, and I hope really that J.D. Vance doesn't end up like Mike Pence, becoming a Jesuit asset, because it's pretty worrying seeing him there going to the Vatican over and over again, even wearing the tie that Pope Francis gave to him before he died. I mean, of course, I give him the benefit of doubt. He's a new convert, he's somebody who doesn't necessarily understand completely the politics of the Vatican. However, this book is also about the Jesuit influence in places like China, Japan, and what happens when the Jesuits arrive there, and also what happens to us now that there hundreds of years of Jesuits in the Far East have definitely created a collaboration going with places like China or even Japan that initially rejected them. And then you have, of course, the final chapter in which I describe the relation with the rise of technocracy, the age of technocracy, the AI, robotics, the fact that the Jesuits are really no longer in favor of beliefs like Satan or hell, but rather very much inclined to push relativism in that sense. And of course, I also explain the female side of the Jesuit order, which is very little is known about it, especially here in America and in English-speaking countries. So I think that I gave you now a summary of what this book is about. Of course, you went through it and you will have some questions, specific questions. But this book, like I said, it's about demystifying also a lot has been said about Club Bilderberg, the World Economic Forum, the Club of Rome, but nobody really has put them in relation to the Jesuit order in the way that I have done in this book. And I think that it's important going then from number 12. Once you have read volume 12, which you don't have to necessarily read after reading all the others, you might have then the interest to go down the ladder and at that point read volume 11, 10, 9, 8. You can do it in that way. You know, I mean, you don't have to go from 1 to 12. You can do it also in a de-escalating way, because these 12 volumes are built a little bit like Jacob's ladder. You can go up backwards and forwards on it. The understanding is always the same. And so I hope that people are curious enough to dwell into further research instead than always scratching the surface, maybe with a page or two on the internet.
Going into the one thing I don't think I think you probably explained it. I just didn't grasp it, as you said, towards the end of the 20th century, so like late 19, like I guess 1990s, said that there was a measurable decline in intelligence agency capabilities across the world and the Vatican. Is that because of the end of the Cold War? Is that just a general sort of disarming?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that a lot of errors were made in the Vatican, though. That was also the moment of counterintelligence after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain. There were a lot of suspected agents within the Vatican, within the seminaries, within various religious orders. So a counterintelligence unit was established thanks to Jesuit Father Robert Graham. And there is a long tradition that goes back to Pope Pius V that created the entity, the Holy Alliance. Initially, it was called the Holy Alliance, which the Jesuits headed. It means the Vatican Intelligence Unit that was created right at the beginning of the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation was really also the reason why the Jesuits were finally accepted in 1540 within the church, a little bit before that other turning point in the history of the churches was the Council of Trent. So I think that without the Jesuits, we couldn't have one of the most developed intelligence assets in the world. In fact, like I state in my book, their archives that supposedly are in Aspesi in Spain, supposedly are also the bigger archives and even bigger than the ones of the CIA in Langley. So, I mean, these these statements that I make, as you know, are always corroborated by facts and by sources that are credible and that then give more credibility to my own assertions, my own statements that might shock people. No, the fact that from in one of my confessions, I explain how the Jesuits recruit in the universities, especially in the field of intelligence, even the scholars who then become later involved with the Central Intelligence Agency or other intelligence agencies. So when you actually go to a Jesuit school, the education mission of the Jesuit order, which became their mission stated in the Constitution that was accepted by the Pope in 1540 in Tivoli, when Ignazio Loyola personally went there and had this constitution approved, the educational factor covers up, of course, also the intelligence factor. You can't have I mean, a lot of these professors by day, but intelligence operatives by night, because people have, at times a romanticized vision of the intelligence with 007s running around with guns and stuff and all that. But in reality, there is a lot of work, which, as you know, is done in archives, is done in setups that can be called intellectual circles, and of course using the cover of Masonic lodges that give a certain secrecies and other secret societies that, like I explain in my book, have always been used by the Jesuits. And so the Jesuits are the ones who write the narrative in the course of the last 5 centuries, because they were established in 1540, but they actually informally established themselves in Montmartre in France in 1534, and we are almost 500 years after that. And we are actually over 500 years since Ignazio Loyola in 1522 had those visions that brought him to elaborate that those spiritual exercises, which are, as you know, very well described in my book, because not many people know about them. Those ones who know about them use them and are in that way connected to the egregor, the fourth form of the Jesuit order. And it's like a way for them to bring even the laicity, to bring even the politician, the businessman in the fold by reciting those exercises annually with them, maybe for a couple of weeks in a monastery or somewhere, because that's where they usually politicians get invited for doing what is supposed to be a spiritual endeavor, but in reality is a way of the Jesuits to brainwash, coerce, and control these people. So when we talk about the world of the intelligence, the Vatican intelligence manages, as you know, relationship with the countries that at times are not directly connected. For example, with the United States, like Iran. I mean, if you have to get America in contact with Iran, then maybe the Vatican functions as an intermediary. Uh, so you have, relations between the Vatican and different countries, including places where there may not be formal relations yet. China, for example, was not really recognized. They recognized Taiwan as China in 1951, but then in the end, they ended up doing a Vatican-China deal. And through Theodore McCarrick, they worked both with the CIA as well as with this other guy who was a sort of double agent, this former, now late bishop of the Patriotic Church. There is a Vatican-China deal, which, as you know, I go very much into detail here in this book, which is at the moment disturbing for a lot of Catholics and Christians in China, where there is actually more and more since the signing of this deal in the fall of 2018, the persecution of the traditional church values, and also removing crosses, images of Jesus has become a routine conducted by a communist church that feels they can do anything after having given a lot of money to the Vatican and having signed this deal, which is still for the majority of us a secret deal because nothing is being revealed outside of the Vatican walls, aside from the fact that the Vatican recognizes those bishops that were in some way nominated by the Chinese Communist Party, which had created their own Catholic Church in the 1950s, which is also something that people don't know much about. So I think that they will learn that the Jesuits played a very important role with China simply because they have been there from the start. When this first seven Jesuits, including Ignazio Loyola, established the order, one of them was, of course, immediately sent to China, Matteo Ricci. There is even a shrine to, still in Beijing to Matteo Ricci. So we are talking about almost 500 years of relationship with China. And that relation, of course, is a privileged relation. So there was some difficulty at the beginning when Mao Zedong established his own thing with the Communist Party at the end of the Long March and, of course, the Civil War. And a lot of Catholics were persecuted or sent out, the Catholic clergy and even the Jesuits. But then some Jesuits were brought into the fold, like this guy, which I showed, which then became an asset for the Chinese Communist Party. The Bishop Aloysius Jean Luxian worked as a agent for both the Chinese Communist Party, the Jesuits, and even the CIA. We find his name in the sources of information that the CIA was using to know things about the Vatican. So it was quite interesting that at times the CIA was actually getting their information from somebody who related to the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, that seems quite insane, but we have to also understand, and I explain this, as you know, in my book, that at times we're talking about double, triple, quadruple agents in a community, intelligence community where there is a lot of gray areas, let's say. So the Vatican, like you said, but not only the Vatican, in the late 19th century, many governments experienced significant declines in their intelligence services. And then later on, after the Cold War, this decline also seemed to be present because it was like, I think, an error, especially for the United States, to kind of lower their guard towards communism and the culture that comes out of it, because then we suddenly have Europe. As you know, I explained that a group like the Club Bilderberg, that was pushing the American values, that was pushing NATO, that was pushing the European Union, and became a very important asset in that regard. And it was created by a guy called Joseph Rattinger, who was a Jesuit seminarian. Suddenly, they felt that they didn't have to defend those American values anymore after the fall of the Soviet Union. I think that has been one of the biggest errors that we also committed here in America, because then it left the possibility to China to start creeping in with their own form of communism, which is even more insidious than the Soviet Union ever was. So I think that that gives you an understanding why. And then, of course, I explain in my book that espionage was is often connected with diplomacy, and so it goes hand in hand with diplomacy as well as it goes hand in hand with journalism. So you find spies very much within the foreign journalists, correspondence, war correspondence, as well as within the diplomatic corps of various countries, because in an embassy, you always have spies, but
Sure.
formally they might have another, they can't go around and saying, I work for the CIA in the embassy of Oslo, or I work for, they can't say that. They will always have another role, I don't know, cultural attaché or some bullshit like that. Then after so I think that in this though book of mine, as you know, I also describe how the Jesuits within the intelligence world has always had a very much respect for more the community. Eh, because let's think about how they were born. I mean, they were born in a moment historical difficulty for the Vatican. The first enemy, perceived enemy, was United Kingdom, the English crown. But the English crown then reacted by creating their own intelligence, and people like John Dee, Sir Francis Bacon. I mean, that unit created by the British crown became the most fierce intelligence, which gave birth to the 007 myth, because John Dee signed himself 007. So it's like, in a way, without the Jesuits, we will not have had the espionage as we know it in the Anglo-Saxon world. So, I mean, in a way, that's why I explain also in my book they have very much a presence in the intelligence community. They participate to international symposium, conferences in relation to intelligence, and so on. And there's a lot of respect in that sense. Culture is not a passive thing. Culture can be a matter of speculation or intellectual speculation, but it can also become a weapon in the right hands. And the Jesuits have always known that.
Well, perfectly dovetailing is it's one of the things you talk about in the book, right? Is the idea that essentially you can reach the highest level of purity of soul in this life, and on this earth you can become as close to God and close to his communion as close to communion with God as possible. Okay, sure, it sounds all good and flowery, but then it follows up with, and therefore you can take place in hedonistic orgies of drugs and sex, and it does not tarnish your soul because you're so pure. And that's where you can kind of see the abuse of it, right? It goes from, it's like if I was a Buddhist and I was like, I'm a bodhisattva, I'm on the eightfold path. You're like, oh, cool, Tommy's a Buddha, and then I'm like, and that's why I can sleep with children. You'd be like, no, 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 no. But that's kind of what you see. Could you elaborate on that a little more about how they're taking this idea of, being Christ-like, and then because of that, you're allowed to partake in any and all
That the
degeneracy?
question that you're answering relates very much to the fourth vow here of the Jesuits, because that was one of the reasons why the Jesuits got accepted by the Pope in the first place, after Ignacio Loyola being persecuted by the Dominicans and the Inquisition for a long time, because, of course, suspected of being an occultist and relating to things that were, of course, deemed dangerous by the Catholic Church. And so why he was accepted? Because in the fourth vow of absolute submission to the missions and to the Pope rather than to Jesus or Christianity, the Pope doesn't expect that Christ-like thing. I even say in my write in my book that this Jesuit general in Japan ended up after a few hours of torture and giving up everything and going to work with the Japanese. I mean, it was like, I mean, you should give the example. You should get martyrized. You should really feel like Jesus is calling you to heaven. Instead, after a few hours, it was just like, okay, I'm just gonna.
All right,
You know,
I'm done.
I'm done. I'm just going to work for you, no problem. We have the testimony in my book of Totom Nagy, who is one of the who was one of the most trusted agents of the late Superior General Father Pedro Arrupe, who, in a way, describes how he's a Mason, but he's also a Jesuit. His Masonic principles, but then you have his Jesuit principle, and then he even builds a family with kids and stuff. And he goes back to Rome, and they say, "Well, don't worry, you are a fourth-bow Jesuit. If you want, you can always come back into the fold because you have done your mission and you have worked for us in the right way." So during their missions, if they were, like, for example, undercover and they built up a family, that wasn't a problem even. So, I mean, even that vow of castity that is part of the four vows was kind of superseded by the fact that they had to commit to a job, to a mission that is at instead of being at His Majesty's service, at the Superior General service, and of course that had to exceed any other oath that they might have taken, oath that might have been taken in Freemasonry for political reasons or so on. So I think that in the end, the Jesuits are about opportunism, if we have to really be honest. No, I mean,
Well,
yes.
that's it's like any
I mean,
organization.
calling
Yeah.
yourself the idea of Jesus, you will relate it to being really Christian and being really close to Jesus. No, instead, like I said in my book, in the end, it's actually totally the opposite. I mean, you call yourself Society of Jesus, but in reality, you are not really Christian.
And it shouldn't be a surprise though, in the same way that, pedophiles don't go hang out at a school and say I'm a pedophile, right? They roll up in a van that says candy and puppies. Like
Yes.
it's what evil people do.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
it doesn't make it right, but I get
Camouflaging themselves, it's a characteristic. And
yeah.
that's why I said also in my book that the danger of the Jesuit is that you don't really see him coming, because if you knew he was a Jesuit, of course, it would be obvious. It would be like a thief, announcing himself, "I'm a thief, I'm here to rob you." No, the Jesuit will not present himself with his real nature, and so then it becomes really insidious. I think that is, and I think that this present Pope has an even more insidious nature, even if he's not a Jesuit, because he's an Augustinian, and but because of the fact that he was recruited by Pope Francis and the Jesuits to arrive to the papacy and establish himself as the successor of Pope Francis, and at times even give those little sweets to the conservative, like little things like, okay, the family unit is a man and a woman, and everybody, oh, wow, we are back to the tradition of
Yeah.
Pope. I It is all about convenience and opportunism to bring back to the fold a lot of people that probably have stopped going to church on Sunday, and that means money, because let's not forget it's about cash flow. When you go to mass, you
Hmm.
deposit money at the end of the mass, and that money goes to the Vatican. It goes to the treasury of the Vatican that needs that cash flow. And so they have understood that definitely being too overly woke in the exterior has put some problem. But then we see that still you have James Martin, who is the Jesuit supervisor of the present Pope, who is completely flamboyant and has established outreach, LGBT, and all that. And I think that at the moment there is also in these new generations a need for religion because the pandemic has created a lot of mental health issues and stuff. And so, for this reason, probably they think, I mean, these people do some very, because of their position in the academic world and of knowledge, they might have done a really complex study in order to mold also the future figure of the Pope in the way that people think is likable. The fact that he's American rather than being from another country is because America stays on top of the donations when it comes down to the Vatican.
You think that's it?
So it's like, if there was another country that was equally giving as much, they would probably make a pope from that country. But when there was a whole discussion in this conclave of going completely full libertad, if we want to go, or full leftist with the Filipino Chinese Pope, with Antonio Luis Tagle, this archbishop who is of Filipino Chinese ancestry, at the beginning it gathered some 18 votes, which is for the first day probably not too bad. But then, of course, the discussions within the conclave were focused on the fact that the Jesuits were very pragmatic in their decision to put Prevost there. And so Prevost, then the first thing he says, though, is talking about the AI, which is, he said, even, the AI inspired his name. So, I mean, that is pretty troubling. But then you have also the fact that he says, I'm continuing with the Second Vatican Council policies and on the path of what Pope Francis has done. I'm not moving from there. I'm not going back. I'm not going back to a pre-Vatican, Second Vatican Council, or I'm not scrapping away, I'm not taking away those progressive reforms that Pope Francis has done. He wants to continue in those reforms. And so I think that is definitely a wolf in sheep's clothing. And at the same time, like I explained in my book, the Jesuits and the Freemasons have pushed more and more for a shift towards the left. And that is a shift that was favored, as you know, by the Black Pope during just after the Second Vatican Council, Padre Pedro Arrupe. It went on with Hans Kovenbach and then Adolf Nicholas, and then now the present Black Pope, which is the head of the Jesuits, which is Arturo Sosa. So I think that people need to understand that this what goes on in Borgo Santo Spirito, which is the headquarters of the Jesuits, though, is not only of a religious nature, it's of a political, ideologic nature. It's about pushing climate change, it's about pushing transgenderism, it's about pushing immigration reform, it's about pushing all those politics that we think are hideous, but they are trying to sell us as really being Christian because Jesus was a communist. That is kind of the
Yeah.
narrative here in the end, which, of course, in this book is well reflected by the back cover in which I have substituted here. This is a painting that you find in the Mother Church of the Jesuits, in which Ignacio Loyola is giving a red flag by Jesus. Already that is quite indicative. But then I added with my graphic designer, Vincenzo Viceversa, who is a great master in these kind of things and with a very big understanding of symbology, brought up in an area full of monasteries and so on, with an understanding and working also at times with the Catholic Church. There is a symbol of the communist there. And there is also here, if you really go close to that guy who seems,
Oh
just
yeah.
That is actually the face of Karl Marx. So
Oh,
I mean,
really?
it is kind of modified, you know. So it's really Catholicism and communism. Like I explained, there was this big discussion in after the Second Vatican Council, and that discussion by people like Father Totom Nagis gives us a testimony unique in this book because then we go from one congregation to the other in which the elements of this merger of communism and Catholicism, which becomes also liberation theology, is becoming more and more present from the 32nd General Congregation to the 33rd, where you have also social justice and ecology that brings up also in the 90s the climate change agenda. I mean, it is really relevant if you think about it. And so it's relevant because then you understand who is really pulling the strings. And it's not the Freemasons or the Illuminati who ultimately are puppets in front of the Jesuits.
It would make sense, like you said, when he comes out and goes, nuclear families between a man and a woman. Yeah, it is bait for people to. You're right, but the way you said it made me think is you have people going, "Oh, we're returning to tradition," and it's like, what a sad state of affairs that we are now clapping for the proclamation that a nuclear family is between a man and a woman.
I mean, we shouldn't even be discussing. I mean, for
No,
like in a Christian, it should be obvious, like
yeah,
like
it,
you have the sun and you have the moon, but
yeah.
also the confusion that has been really raised, especially by the Jesuits in publications like America, the Jesuit Review, people like James Martin, people who have dwelt in that chaos. And then, the University of San Francisco of the Jesuits establishing a transgender, safe area so you can be. Hey, come on, man. What kind of like thing is this? I mean, in a university where you have the Jesuits, you will always have the most progressive narratives. And I explain it very well in the case of Fordham. And then also how they prepare people who then end up like, for example, a female priest in the Episcopal Church. Now, the Episcopal Church itself, which is supposed, to be coming from the Anglican Church, and so the Church of England, which rebelled to Rome, nowadays is completely controlled by the Jesuits. But also the Anglican Church in England is controlled by the Jesuits. I know that for sure because my mother used to be the head of the British Expats, knows very well, even if she's Catholic, because like I told you, and like you see in my book, the Lion family has a long Jacobite and Catholic tradition. But she's, of course, privileged to be connected to the royal family, and so she knows very well what happens within the Church of England. And the leader of the Church of England goes to Rome often, and of course goes to the Vatican to take his marching orders nowadays, which was something completely unthinkable even 100 years ago.
Mm.
Where, as I explain in my book, there was still an elite in England thinking like H.G. Wells that the Jesuits were inherently evil and that England had done the right choice to rebel to Rome back in the days. But it's no longer like that. So they control most of the Christian churches, and they want to continue unifying them under the Vatican II ideals, which eventually will also call for the merger of many other religions that, of course, are Buddhism, Islam, and so on. I mean, I myself, as you know, volume 10, you read volume 10, and I write very much about the direct involvement of the Jesuits with Islam. But people tend to ignore all this because these are very complex subjects that can be understood only after very careful examination. So for me to actually summarize everything in a book and make it available, it's good, I think, for the majority of people who really want to have finally a way of grasping this matrix. And it's not about the surface of the matrix. It's not about, the deep state. Yeah, but what is this deep state? The Illuminati. Yeah, but who are these Illuminati?
Yeah.
Or who are these Freemasons? And why are they acting this way? And some of them maybe are acting another way. Or why we had the establishment of the United States of America by a series of people who, of course, seem to be completely detached from Rome. But then, like I explain in my book, have basically
Yeah.
accept the Romanism right at the center of power, which is the
Mhm.
Capitol Hill and the capital of the United States of America, which Washington, D.C., Maryland, Rome, the Tiber, and the connection with the Carroll family. All these things, of course, that I'm citing need to be then studied within the book to understand the relevance and the importance. Which brings us to another topic. The Jesuits and the Vatican, in reality, in the end, are simply Roman power, the power of ancient Rome, the power of the ancient pagan cults, from the cult of Jupiter to the cult of Isis to the cult of Cybele. These are cults that have never really disappeared. They are simply been
Rebranded.
rebranded. And of course, in the Catholic reality, you can rebrand anything because you have all these saints that make it so easy. You see, when you have the evangelic churches, the Protestant church, you have a reality in which, of course, Martin Luther saw what was happening, and then Calvin, and they really purged the Christian faith of these elements that were, because they saw that they could be abused. Instead, when it comes down to South Central America, I mean, there it's a kind of like, or the Caribbeans or wherever. I mean, and everything arrives then in New Orleans with voodoo, hoodoo, and everything else merged with Catholicism. And then we have a Pope that actually has grandparents that come from there. And it's no coincidence, even born in Haiti, one of them. I mean, it's like, so I think that the Catholic faith, the way it was established, it was, of course, in the shadow of Rome and the power of Rome. Even if this power was declining, because eventually will decline with the barbarians, the arrival of, the barbarians in Rome and everything. It was like, they were threatened, but they managed to kind of transform in something else. They became a spiritual, between brackets, power, but also very much a political power, because the Pope is still a political power to this day, and he was, of course, a political power 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years. It's not like the power they represent is the power that used to be of the emperor and of the Pontifex Maximus, who used to be itself a figure that controlled these religions that were, of course, a variety in ancient Rome. And eventually they will merge in one big universal faith, which is the Catholic faith, that by nature is universal. Then, of course, you had the Protestant Reformation that wanted to detach from that, that wanted to emphasize God's sovereignty, the predestination, the importance of Scripture. The Jesuits never did that. If you go in Latin countries, in places like Italy, or they do everything possible to get people to not read the Bible. I mean, they really, even, I know for sure that within even the seminaries, certain things are kept, like they really push people to have a different approach that leads them away from, so yes, you follow the tradition of the saints, you follow the processions, you follow the masses, which, by the way, up until the Second Vatican Council were in Latin, and so most people couldn't even understand at one point what they were saying. A little bit like Islam, everything is recited in Arab, even in countries which have no clue what they're saying. So it becomes like a mantra more than an understanding of
Yeah.
something. But in any case, the fact that you give more relevance to a saint than to God, and the saint has to be the intercessor, the guy who you are praying so you can reach God. Well, and then you do all this through the church. Well, I mean, guys, obviously the Martin Luther and John Calvin had a heyday in that
Hmm.
moment because at the beginning of the 16th century, that they were really right in their attack. Rome was decadent. Rome was decadent. The Pope was bringing forward those, a lot of pagan elements, the Hermetica. The Renaissance was fueled up by the Hermetica that, as you know, filtered through the Iberic Peninsula, where the Inquisition fought groups like the Alumbrados, which were merging all this, Gnosticism, Islamic mysticism, Kabbalah, and all that. But of course, all this had to be controlled by Rome. And so, in the end, the Jesuits, who had a knowledge of all this, could be the ideal controllers. While they were persecuting people because they were practicing magic, maybe, they themselves were doing the same thing, but nobody could touch them because, of course, they took over from the Dominicans and they became in charge of the Inquisition, which made it possible for them to maybe persecute a woman that was suspected of being a witch while they were actually doing some evocation of the devil on the side, and nobody would tell them anything because, they were the Jesuits, and they were in charge of the education, of everything, of the Christian teachings, of their interpretation, and so on. But I repeat, it was right in that period of time in which you see John Calvin and Martin Luther, which, by the way, Martin Luther was an Augustinian friar. And like I explain in my book, as you know, the first conspiracy against the Jesuit was made by an Augustinian friar 11 years after the foundation of the Jesuits, who went on the pulpit and started to condemn this order. Nowadays, we have an Augustinian Pope, but this Augustinian Pope is, of course, aligned with the Jesuits. It will not be permitted. And there is no order within the Catholic Church, but also there is actually, in putting an Augustinian as the head of the Catholic Church, there is almost like wanting to repair for what Martin Luther did, who was an Augustinian. It's almost like the order has to repair for their sins and for the loss of flock. So you now have to do that for us. And so that's where I see this Pope, where, by the way, it's a Pope that needs to do something about pedophilia, but if he starts doing nothing, he will bring on himself a lot of criticism because, of course, we know that in the past he himself has been covering for pedophilia, which is still a great problem in the church. So this is a really, people will say, but you are heretical, you are criticizing the Pope. Oh, the Pope is the representative of God. Guys, if you want to still believe in Father Christmas, you can believe in Father Christmas. It's no problem. I mean, but I mean, I am a bit more mature. And you see, during my series of confessions, we start from volume one, goes up this pyramid and brings you there. As you know, I also discuss other things of importance, the Gnostics, who were, of course, the Illuminati of their time, just like the Alumbrados, which Ignazio Loyola was part of, were practicing Gnosticism, an understanding of Christianity which wasn't really pure. It was kind of like filled with esoteric elements that really didn't have anything to do with the original message. Jesus at the end was it was a Jewish rabbi who was very much into God one. God one, then here, of course, you have the fact that then the church became the church of James the brother, and then though it became more relevant as the church of Paul, who apparently never met Jesus in person, but was inspired by him and encountered him on his way to Damascus. And we all know what happened because Paul was a Roman who then becomes a leading figure in the future of the Christian of Christianity. I think that the whole Reformation that went through Europe pushed the Vatican to accept the compromise of this very dubious religious order, but also 20 years after its foundation, as you know, they also approved the foundation of the first intelligence unit. So that demonstrated that the Jesuits were not just priests, but they were something more. And they were assassins in a way, not like the Knights Templars, who they wanted to fill this vacuum that was missing in the Catholic Church, because they, of course, persecuted the Templars. The Templars' mission was banking. The Jesuits instead substituted with education. And at the same time, though, they followed in the footsteps of the Knights Templars. Ignacio Loyola and his first Jesuits were very much obsessed by the Knights Templars' legacy. But the Knights Templars were warrior monks. They were in-your-face warriors. They could kill you if you challenged them in a duel, if you were, The Jesuits are more insidious. They're not formally military. They have this structure, which is obviously military because on top is a general, but then it's more insidious because they present themselves as just like priests. And then you have the coadjutors, so the ones that don't take the votes of the priesthood, but still are considered Jesuits and live amongst the Jesuits. And then on top of that, like I explain in my book, you have ultimately people who are at times can be even non-Catholic, who become fifth-class Jesuits and report directly to Borgo Santo Spirito, like the Clintons. Or if they are Catholics, they become definitely very powerful, like Nancy Pelosi. So I think that in this book, as we are going towards the end of our transmission, it's very important also the exposition of what I said of Donald J. Trump and his time with the Jesuits. We
That's
did.
I was going to ask that before we wrapped up. Because you went into detail, and I'm glad you did because you said it's true. Because a lot like myself who like Trump said there's a lot of things he does, if not everything he does, where you go, that is in direct contradiction to traditional Catholic values or Christian values, from the vaccine in the last administration to his current one. You point that out and you're like, he's doing a lot of stuff that if anyone else did, people would be screaming about. But because Trump does it, and I think you point out, you're like, not exactly, you're like, he lives in like a gold penthouse. Like, it's not exactly the humble Christian figure, but nonetheless, he gets outright support from myself included, as someone that identifies as a Christian. He does. Could you touch on that before we wrap up about the contradictions of Donald Trump?
The contradiction, it could be perceived as an agent of chaos, but in reality, there is an order within his perceived madness. There is a line of conduct which he has acquired by studying with the Jesuits theology, philosophy for a couple of years in Fordham, but he has also refused and angered the Jesuits at Fordham University when he didn't want to join their secret societies, because those secret societies operating in Fordham, like the Fordham Club, were built for then having complete and utter loyalty to the Jesuits. So the Jesuits who operate in Fordham, it's a little bit like I went and studied in a school and I studied philosophy and pedagogy with the Jesuits. Does that make me a Jesuit? No, because just like Trump, I have understood the Jesuits, but then in the end, I rejected them. And when you rejected them, though the Jesuits and their, of course, agents and loyal followers then attack you brutally and they will criticize you and so on. However, you will have understood the way the Jesuit works, and so you will enact at times. When it came to him embracing the vaccines, he was definitely brought for a ride by a Jesuit stooge and agent like Dr. Anthony Fauci, who was brought up by the Jesuits, who became a Jesuit professor, who at Georgetown University, who is still at the moment an academic working for the Jesuits. And so Trump believed in a way something that he shouldn't have endorsed became something that he endorsed out of necessity in his first administration. He was unfortunately not prepared enough to reject the Jesuit element. He even got to trust a guy like Mike Pence, who clearly demonstrated to be in bed with the Jesuits, because 1 year after visiting Pope Francis, he betrayed him in front of the world. So that's why today we have a different Trump that is very much in control. So if Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance, the Catholics who were standing at St. Peter's Square at the installation of Pope Francis, become dangerous, I'm sure that Trump will perceive that. And so I think there's a difference here between the first Trump and the second Trump. But at the same time, Trump was a guy who studied with the Jesuits and rejected the Jesuits in a way that happens very rarely. And in fact, as you know, in my book, I cite a member of the Episcopal Church, Stapleton Smith, who is from the same institution of the infamous Marian Bude, the one that condemned Trump from the pulpit as soon as he arrived in Washington. But the actual way that Stapleton Smith studied in Fordham, Meg Stapleton, and she's a queer theologian, a leftist educator, and all that. And from the way she condemns Trump, you can see the hate that these people have for Trump. The people who, like Nancy Pelosi, are Jesuit agents. I mean, Nancy Pelosi actually worked with Theodore, like I explained in my book, with Theodore McCarrick for the Vatican-China deal, actively as an agent. So I'm talking here about, not just hypothetical, this is real stuff that happened. And I think that in the end, people, when they read this book and they understand that the Democratic Party, for example, is an extension of the Jesuits, but also that people like Jeb Bush were an extension of the Jesuits, or people like those rhinos in the Republican Party that we still have at times, or the past version of the Republican Party that it was perceived as the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon, proud, whatever, of George W. Bush or his father, but in the end, when you actually study in detail how it works and which secret societies they were working with, you see that they were all in bed with the Jesuits and that they were very much maneuvered by them. And so that is the difference. I think that Trump had, of course, his Jesuit education plays a part, but on the contrary of these leftists, where they embrace the political views the Jesuit education prides itself on, which are all leftist, he has rejected that. He has clearly rejected that. He's fighting them on every single point. And what Tom Homan, who is a Catholic, is doing, and also, underlining and pointing out to the Vatican, you have bigger swords than we have, and you shouldn't, he's doing a great job in that sense. I mean, clearly, it's not easy to fight a system which has been built in hundreds of years. And so we will always have some level of compromise along the way, like we saw with Rubio and J.D. Vance going to the Pope, which is the first American Pope. So obviously, as an act of diplomacy, you have to do something like that. But then let's hope that that doesn't become then a political problem. I hope that this Pope will refrain from becoming so obvious like Pope Francis became at the end of his papacy, where he was just, sending messages to US bishop conferences against Trump on immigration, doing this and that. And I hope he refrains. Unfortunately, I think that he is very much on a stealth mode, and then sooner or later he's going to show his true colors.
Yeah.
So I think that that is unfortunately what's going to happen because from his statements, if you want to be following up on what Pope Francis was doing and Vatican II is telling you to do, then of course you are not a conservative Pope like somebody was hoping. And so sooner or later, also the fact that he has been involved as bishop in Peru, covering pedophilia, but also with the immigrants, pushing all the issues of the immigrants and all that might come to surface at one point and might clash with with Trump, like Bannon said. But of course, we can always hope for a miracle. Yeah, who knows, you know? Um, it's of course touching that nerve. I think the fact that he's an American Pope, and of course the sense of pride of the
Mm.
Americans of having the first American Pope. I think there is really where this psyop is orientated. So it's a psychological operation that involves a whole nation here. Now, the moment in which this Pope feels that Trump is weak, I'm sure he will attack.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's to be expected. Um, but yeah, Leo, I'll let you run because we're coming up on an hour. But dude, as always, it's awesome to talk with you. I love having you on. You're legitimately a fun person to have on, and I can't recommend the book enough. But yeah, I mean, it's Rome didn't fall. It's and you can see it through everything you explained about DC. It's pretty clear that that's what
This is
it.
12 volumes that are like an encyclopedia that, of course, people should read to have a complete understanding of the reality rather than the myth of the Illuminati. And, of course, the reality behind other secret societies or societies with secrets like Freemasonry and think tanks and contemporary culture. I think that with volumes like Volume 8, for example, you can really have a deep dive in the entertainment industry at the same time, you can understand more about mind control and how it all relates to this world with volume 11, or you can have a profound understanding of cyber Satan with volume 6.66, volume 7, volume 9. In the end, I'm not gonna, God willing, I'm never gonna stop doing books, but I didn't feel that I could go on with a series that, in my eyes, has completed his mission. So it's essential to start somewhere, and I would suggest you start with volume 12.
Do you have any other books in the works?
Of course, but that will be announced further on because now I'm involved in the promotion of this book, which is still a bestseller and will hopefully be a great success for the whole course of the summer. It's a book that definitely needs to be read, so I'm going to be promoting it. And then, of course, then I think before the end of the year, I might bring out another book. But it's, like I said, no longer going to be a Confessions of an Illuminati. And there's going to be just books on specific subjects of interest relating to these topics. But of course, the Confessions have always had somehow a personal also no element. That's why they're called confessions, and that's why at the end of the volume 12 there is a specific revelations that are given that I think people needed to to study and to read. These are books that, yes, can be read, but can also be kept as manuals where you can go back and then pick up things and then maybe go into further, deeper studies. So thank you so much for having me on.
Of
As
course.
usual, I will always invite people to go to leozagami.com for my latest articles and keep me posted
Yes,
with
sir.
everything, Thomas.
Yes,
And
sir.
take
Yes,
care.
sir. Well, Leo, it's always great having you on here, brother. And don't be a stranger. Hit me up, and I'd love to have you back on.
No worries. It will be always a pleasure.
All
Take
right,
care.
Leo. Thank you so much for your time. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Please go to the description. Please go to this website. Please go grab the book. There's even UFOs in there. We didn't touch on that, but it's a great book. Leo, thank you so much.